Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's episode of Ramblemancy. An episode where I did my preparation. It's an episode about preparing for things. I did my preparation for this episode by choking on water. So, if you'll have to excuse me for a bit here. Um, but yes, tonight we are joined by Claire Jackson, of the Infinite Construct.
Hello.
Welcome. It's good to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So tonight we're going to be talking about prepping for the game as players and GMs. But before we get into that, I'm going to spend a few moments staring confusedly at the camera while I try to remember whether or not we have announcements. Yes, we do. There's a bit of a there's been a bit of a delay on VODs making their way to YouTube this and last week. Um, I am going to try to get them done, but I also received my second medically sanctioned stabbing today and might be dead to the world for the next couple of days. So we will see how that goes. Um, Jafet says, "If only you had control of when you went live, Lucas." Look, in fairness, I started choking on water well before I hit the live button, so it's just the after effects. They stick with you.
Several minutes of everyone else in the Zoom call being like, "You okay? You good? You good, man?"
But yeah. So the VODs for ideally, I will have both last week and this week's episode of In Too Deep up tomorrow, but we will see. I promise nothing, but ideally that's what will happen. Um, Otherwise, I know all of our some of you who won some of the giveaways during our charity campaign have started receiving your giveaways, and that's fantastic. So I know most, if not everything, has shipped. So be those of you who won stuff, be on the lookout. It's coming. So, and if you don't get it by if you still don't have stuff by mid June, definitely reach out because you should 100% have it by then. So, yeah. Otherwise, I think that's everything. Yeah, I think that's all we got. Oh, actually, there is one more thing, and that is as for next week's Ramblemancy. That is a week from today, at this very time, on this very channel. Age of Fit has proven to have been somewhat psychic about rule of lore stuff, which is next week we are having some of the In Too Deep crew here on Ramblemancy to talk about whatever happened, whatever comes up. So we'll have some of the In Too Deep crew here, and yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. So I think that's all I've got. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's everything that we've got going on. So,
Yeah.
without any further ado, John, what do you got for us?
Yes, tonight on Ramblemancy, we'll be discussing the
No,
much debated topic of game
muted,
preparation.
muted, immediately muted.
I can do Valley Girl instead if you want. Those are the two options. There's Old Man John and there's Valley Girl John. I have a million other voices, but those are the only two that I will do for Ramblemancy, apparently. This all just so that I can buy myself time to ask to figure out what my actual question is going to be, which I think was somewhere in the vicinity of, yes, tonight we are talking about game preparation, or preparing for tabletop role-playing games, both from a GM perspective and from player perspectives, because players also do things to get ready for a session or even a campaign of role-playing games, and there's a lot that goes into that. So I think we were just talking about this kind of pre-show, but I think starting with just a simple question: are you a pantser or are you a planner?
Well, what was the first part?
Are you a pantser or are you a planner? Do you fly by the seat of your pants when you're making characters? You make a list of or planning your games. You make a list of bullet points or a few important things, and then you kind of just run from there, or planners being those who like very meticulously like plot out kind of each like beat of the story, or like a friend of mine from like a player perspective is known to write out like just an absolute like Silmarillion length and detail for his character backstories. So
Honestly, had you asked me like 2 weeks ago, I would have said I was a pantser. But
Mm.
I think I'm both. But the things that I spend the most time planning are things that are not plot related. Like they're not
mhm.
like I'll come up with like broad strokes idea for the overarching campaign, and then just sort of everything else. Like I think where most of my planning goes is like in into setting, and basically that's it. I mean, I count NPCs as part of setting, so like yeah, and that's it. But like I don't know, somewhere in the middle. That's my answer, I think.
Yeah, that would probably be my answer too. I'm like
Hmm.
somewhere in the middle. What I do tend to do is I have a tendency to like whatever I'm working on, I will like multiply by 3. So if I have one important NPC in a town that I know is going to play a role, I will come up with 2 more NPCs. So now I have 3 to play with. The problem with that is I start doing that a lot. And so so I end up with like really long detailed descriptions of towns, what's going on. But I tend to do that whenever I have something. I'm like, okay, let me make this into, now there are 3 variations on this
Yeah,
when it feels appropriate.
that's
Mhm.
really interesting. I'm thinking about like because I think I my process was pretty similar, but maybe like not as like I think I do that, but it's in terms of like averages. I do it like whatever feels right. Like I do one
Yeah.
important NPC, and then I just kind of go like, okay, I'll make a couple, and then I'm like, okay, now I should focus on something else. But that's really
Hmm.
interesting. I never thought about boiling that down to like having a specific number, because I think that's kind of the thing that I think is interesting about that is that it gives you a limit so that you're like, okay, here's something to work towards, but like if I once I get there, then I can move on to something else. I have the freedom to move elsewhere, but it also gives you like a goal to work towards, so that you kind of have an idea. I'm always a fan of like putting limitations on yourself to increase
Hmm.
creativity. So
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that started because like a whole bunch of years ago, actually, I think it was one of the first Numenera games I ever ran. I was running for some friends, and I introduced an NPC, and one of my players said to the NPC, "Oh, hi, you must be a plot point." And I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna make sure that never happens again."
yeah, yeah, that's fair. Oh man, I saw in chat. Was it Mr. Bright said a detailed backstory for NPCs? Yes, absolutely, 100%. Same boat.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the secret to that for me at the very least is like understanding that these NPCs ought to be doing something in the world.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, detailed as is necessary, but like why are they here? Why are they going to be the people that your player characters end up meeting? And once you start asking those questions, you can start filling in that backstory quite efficiently.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, I was thinking about that in terms of like, cause so recently I've been doing a lot of preparing because I'm running a D&D game for the first time in over a year, I think. Um, and so I've been doing a lot of prep, and one of the things that I've found myself doing more is 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 paying more attention to what you just said, which is rather than just what I used to do was create an NPC and like, oh, I like the concept of this character, and I really like. I used to yeah, focus on like a personality based build of an NPC, but this time around, I think I'm finding myself doing more like what is their purpose in the world, like what are they doing here,
Hmm.
and I'm finding that makes it actually a lot easier to role play them when the players
Oh
talk to
yeah,
them, because
yeah,
now I
and
actually
and
have
sometimes
answers to their questions.
Right. And sometimes you don't need to know like all the way. Like someone
Mhm.
said in the chat, like exposition dumps, like absolutely. So like I ran a game of Vampire this week,
Mhm.
and it was for a bunch of people who were in a previous werewolf game. And so I took one of the player characters, actually my player character from that werewolf game, and made them an NPC in this vampire one shot that took place. It was Vampire 5th edition, so it was like 20 or 30 years later. And I didn't totally know what that character was doing there, but she was like very clearly working with the Anarchs, who are a faction of the vampires. So at the very least, knowing that puts her in a time and a place with some type of action. She's going to be doing something in the moment. I don't really know. I don't know what's happened in the past 20 years for her for the most part, but I know for the most part like what she's supposed to be doing here while I'm running this one shot, and that's enough for when she appears in a scene. It feels more organic.
Yeah. Yeah. That's And I mean, like, and I honestly have been finding that that is the case too. Is just like knowing that the NPC has a specific role in the world. Like the starting town, what I did right is like I went through. I was like, okay, who are the NPCs they're most likely to interact with, and then I took that and I'm like, okay, the baker. Like literally in our Discord, I saw one of my players was like, "Oh, there's a bakery. I'm gonna go there immediately." So I was like, "Well, let me make the baker
Yeah.
NPC," and just sort of figured something out for that. They didn't actually end up interacting with the baker too much, but so you know, your results may vary. But yeah, like that's it made it a lot easier to figure out like how this NPC was going to react to the player characters and their questions. And yeah, it's kind of a revelation for me, that new approach to making NPCs.
It's like I feel like we all go through that stage as GMs of like putting together like the meticulous like notes and like lists of cues and things that NPCs are going to say, and like the quest dialogue and all of that stuff. And then like at a certain point you kind of just like I can't sustain this level of like just super intensive prep that a bunch of which like sometimes is never used.
Yeah, sometimes it gets thrown out.
Yeah,
Yeah, or like you try and shoehorn it in and it feels really really awkward.
that's
And so
me.
like
That's what happens to me.
what I'm feeling from this discussion is be a planner insofar as it allows you to pants and and stop
Absolutely.
there.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah,
set yourself up for success in the GM seat so that you have enough to like prompt your players forward, like give them forward momentum in the story whenever they interact with an element of your world that you've kind of planned. But like you don't have to go much farther than just like knowing why something is there.
Yeah.
Or like not even necessarily why it's there, just like what that person wants, or like just something that that players can latch onto and that you can like both just bounce off of into something new.
Freeman, what were you saying?
I was just gonna say, like from the player's perspective, because that's me, the player, is prepping so far as what the GM needs, and prepping for, because I've recently been looking into the mechanic, like more mechanically building my character around sort of what the skills or abilities that character has a little more. At one point it was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna go fly by the seat of my pants with this barbarian, and it works with the barbarian for the most part.
I mean, seat of the pants is basically the best description of a barbarian. So,
but I do a little bit of, I do what I can for the GM in terms of my character, and then from there a little bit of the mechanics, and then from there I like to just improvise and just see what happens, and try not to like overwrite some information that my character already said. I try not to do that, but I do try to like more or less just kind of go with the flow
yeah,
with my characters.
I think that's a lot easier to do also when you've got a campaign that's been going for a while. So in terms of this like pantser or planner, like I know for campaigns I've had running for months now, there are sessions where I do not prep as much as I did before, because so much already has happened that we've established so much of the world and so much of the characters that we can just jump in and we can all kind of fly by the seat of our pants. And because there's been so much work that's been done for the multiple hours over the course of months, that's all planning. That's all planning
Yeah.
essentially that feeds into what the
Yeah.
game is going to be.
Now, here's a thought too. I think we're talking a lot about a lot of kind of like big tabletop role playing game systems, ones that I think require a fair bit of game prep. Um, or are suitable for like long-term campaigns. But I'm also
Mhm.
thinking about like I think it depends a little bit on the game system itself too, on how much you're able to
Yes.
pants and how much you can actually plan. Because if you look at something like Lasers and Feelings or like a hack for that I wrote recently, Kobolds and Trenchcoats, like it's designed for you to pick up the 2 pages of paper that this game is written on, grab like a fistful of D6s, throw them at your friends, and 15 minutes later you're playing the game. So like
Yeah.
I think like there are some like systems like that that are almost designed for you to just fly by the seat of your pants.
Yeah, I mean systems and also like what the actual theater of the game you're playing is as well. So not just the numbers, but like again with the vampire game that I had run, a big part of the appeal of that is the whole history of the lore and the political and social theater of all of these vampires struggling to maintain control or overthrow people. So like all of that is very that's very important. That's why people play the game. So like you have to know that. You have to put some
Yeah.
time in order to at very least like know what a Camarilla is or what Elysium is. Like those are core functions of the game. So in terms of flying by the seat of your pants with something like that, or a more complex lore heavy game, or even with mechanics, you kind of can't do it as much, or you have to prep if you haven't done it. You have to kind of do a bit of prep where it's like, okay, I don't know all of the political machinations that are going on. I'm going to do enough to know what's going to happen in this handful of scenes I'm going to run tonight.
Well, and I think what you just said is something that I think people could find. I know it's something that I found a little bit intimidating about Star Trek Adventures when I went to run it, because like there's so much existing lore. And like granted, I was playing with a bunch of people who like were not big Trekkies. In fact, many of the people I was playing with got into Trek because we were playing Star Trek Adventures.
Oh, nice.
So, not as a result of me running it, mind you, just as a result of like learning that we were gonna be playing it, and they're like, "Oh, I better learn something about Star Trek."
Mhm.
But like there is a certain amount of the, like you said, lore heavy kind of systems. Um,
Which I should say is true of very heavy mechanical systems that require like
yeah.
like I'm sort of just kind of speaking in general more about just like information that's important to playing the game, whether it's a super RP heavy game that has a lot of lore or a whole bunch of mechanics. That's the reason why people go to it, because they want to have fun with the mechanics. They want to, as a player
Right.
or a GM, they want to gain mastery over that, and that's what the game is. So that's going to really dictate how much time you're going to spend prepping, because you have to deliver that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, and Rose earlier mentioned like wanting to have like stat blocks planned out for things. And if I'm running like Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, like absolutely that's something that's very difficult to pants, because like that's you kind of have to know what the monsters numbers are, because
Mhm.
like so much of D&D is numbers. And so like that's and action economy in that game is wild, like accounting for that. So it's very difficult to just like kind of modify that on the fly
My
unless you're sort of experienced.
my secret to accounting for action economy is to not. So- and like, listen, I'm just gonna throw this thing at you, and you're gonna have to figure the rest out yourself.
But then you're going to have someone who's like, oh, here's this spell from this random book I got, which does this. And I need to know, or the player doesn't need to know, but you as the GM need to know what X stat is of that monster. And if you're just like totally flying
Well,
by the seat
yeah.
of your pants,
Oh,
it's going to be like,
absolutely,
I don't know.
Like
totally.
I
Yeah.
never have to like expected to have to know what the charisma of a skeleton archer was.
I mean, and that's the thing. Like, when I think about that, I mean, I'm thinking more in terms of like the stat block itself. I agree is pretty important, but as far as like, I know that there are some people who get like really into the statistics of D&D, and when they get into their planning, and when or they get really into like considering the action economy of a monster for D&D. I tend not to do that because I'm like, the thing is, players are really smart. Collectively, they are smarter than I, the GM, and so they are going to find some way out of this that I have not considered, and it's going to be awesome. part of the
Yeah.
fun for me as a GM is not knowing stuff, because so much of my job is knowing things. It's great when I don't have to know anything. When my players
Yeah.
surprise me with something, because I just
If we
that's my favorite.
That's what I really enjoy about like running Cypher System games, though. Not to be the Cypher System gal here, but of course, like one of the things I like is you can do both, right? You could very quickly, okay, it's a level 3 creature. Almost all interactions are going to require you to roll a 9.
Exactly.
But if you want to sit down, you want to be like, okay, it's a level 3 creature, but when it's in this type of a situation, it's going to do speed defenses at level 5. You could really start like totally, branching out all of these things to create a really crunchy stat block. At the same time, that same system can be shrunk down in a moment, and you can just roll with it, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's nice. It's so nice. Like, I love that about the Cypher System.
Have you heard the good word that is the Cypher System? Thank you, Geekouts.
I think for me, if I think for me, considering action economy usually comes when I'm trying to upscale or downscale a monster.
Yes.
So like if I'm trying
Yeah.
to take like a CR25 monster and make it doable, like make it doable for like level 12 or 13 players, because I'm like, well, they're not very big yet, but I want them to fight something cool, and this thing is neat, and I'm gonna make it so they can fight it. Like if I'm trying to make it so it doesn't just destroy them, or if I'm trying to take like something that's like really, really cool and flavorful, but it's CR2, and like turn that into like a more interesting fight, then like that's when I start thinking of like about it in terms of like how much can this monster like actually do as compared to like a monster that has a higher challenge rating. But if we get to the point where I'm thinking about DPR, or anyone is saying the letters DPR to me, I have checked out. Damage for chat, damage per round.
Yeah. For me, the knowledge that on a D20, every point up on a D20, like every number has a 5% chance of being rolled. For me, that's trivia. Like, I don't care. It
Yeah.
doesn't factor into my prep. For me, that's trivia.
Mm-hmm. Fun
Yeah, or
fact,
that's with things like that. That's where I turn to video games, because I will just happily allow a computer to crunch that math
Yeah.
for me, because it will be better at it than I will be. So
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. Absolutely. But yeah.
Remy.
Hi, Remy.
I saw Matt welcome Remy, but I don't think I actually saw Remy live.
Um,
There's Remy.
I saw NB Santiago says so many low CR monsters have so much flavor. Yes. Okay, me when we're talking about D&D, I love hobgoblins. Hobgoblins are the coolest shit. Like, I think they're so cool. And so like, but the problem with hobgoblins is that you get, I don't know, you start getting to like level 5 or 6 and suddenly hobgoblins,
You
right?
you steamroll them.
Yeah. And that's really unfortunate. And I think that's when it comes to prep, I think I'm less interested in prepping and figuring out like, oh, what like John said, like the damage per round or like that kind of stuff. And I'm much more interested in saying, how can I still include these in a game that has now moved beyond them? Right? Like, that's, I think, where I tend to focus a lot more of my prep is like, how can I get these in there that are so flavorful and interesting, but still make them a meaningful interaction for the players to have in game. And I think that's kind of where my attention has shifted. Like I said before, like before stream, I sort of hinted at the fact that like, oh, Spigs, hi,
Spigs.
welcome.
hey,
Yeah, I sort of hinted at before like the stream that I mentioned that like running exclusively Cypher for the last almost a year and not running D&D at all during that same time, I think has made me better at running D&D, because what it has done is it's changed the entire psychology that I come to the game with, right? Like I have essentially like managed to sort of, which is kind of what I was trying to do, which is to decouple my brain from the ideology that D&D has inherently in it of being a game that is so crunchy and so rules intensive that there's more ways to say no to players than there are to say yes. And I've managed to like this is a thing that I noticed last night. I was running D&D for the first time in almost a year, but like last night I noticed that I was factoring so much more of that concept into my design of the setting and of like the session. So I at no point was I designing things that were superfluous, like that were going to cause superfluous rolls. For instance, like Cipher System, there's no superfluous rolls. Like if you're rolling, it's because it matters.
Hmm.
And I think D&D tends, even though in the books it says you know it tells you that that's what you should do, there's still an enormous amount of pressure to like make them roll for absolutely everything that they do.
Yep.
And so like
When given a character sheet with 20 skills on it, you
yeah,
you're like, oh, they're doing something. I'll make them
Yeah.
roll a check. They have a check for this.
yeah.
And those skills are like buttons, or how I will cruelly refer to them sometimes as quick time events.
Oh no. It's true though. Yeah. Absolutely. No, and like I've been prepping for the game, I've been listening to a lot of or re-listening to a lot of Matt Colville's Running the Game series, and one of the things he said in one of his videos is and it was something that like I heard and understood intellectually, but until like sort of totally separating myself from like the mindset of D&D didn't really get. And that is that he said something to the effect of like you should never allow your players to roll dice to avoid playing D&D. And I think
That's a wise. Yeah, that's wise.
yeah, like if your players say, okay, I roll to I persuade him, and you're like, okay, you don't just go, okay, roll. You go, okay, how do you do that? What do you
Mhm.
say? And like I would never require a player to like speak in character or whatever, but at the very least tell me like what you're going to say to this person to try to convince him. Like what are your arguments? Like what are you trying to say here? Um, because I think that was just a very succinct way to put that, right? Which is don't allow your players to get away with rolling dice to avoid playing the game. And I think
Yeah.
that's yeah.
Even just getting as far as like, I want to convince him that we're not a threat. I'd be like, okay, cool, make a persuasion check.
Mhm.
Like
Right.
that's if that's like as far as you're comfortable role playing, that's cool with me. You've told me what you want to do, as opposed to I want to make a persuasion check to get out of this. Like, so.
Edgefit, I have to agree. Edgefit says I've got the books that translate the Numenera monsters and stuff into 5e, and reading it, why would you do that to yourself? Yeah, I'd
I think I
much
had
rather
skimmed
go.
through that book and I was like, cool. I
I
just went back to playing Ciphers.
I would much rather translate a D&D monster to Cipher or Numenera
Yeah.
than vice versa.
Mm.
I
I'd be
can't
like,
imagine trying to transfer like a Mokuran or something into Dungeons and Dragons.
Nope.
Like, how does that even work? It can cast shrink or enlarge on itself at will, and also like it's dizzying.
yeah. No, it's
But yeah, I mean, like one of the things I've really started to realize, especially over this year, because I'm running a system on a regular basis that is not as rules heavy or math heavy, is I just spend more time like getting really inspired and psyched to run the game, which sounds like who doesn't do that? But like I will, I'll sit down and I'll like write music. I'll write music that maybe doesn't even get used, and maybe it's like a 16 bar loop. I actually did that to prepare for the vampire game I was going to run. I wanted to put my mind in that world, and one of the ways I expressed myself is music. So I just sat down with a keyboard and a guitar for like an hour and banged out like a 30-second little thing, and that was enough to like have a thing in my head to keep thinking about like the tone or how I wanted characters to feel or how I knew NPCs would feel. And I just spend a lot of time, sometimes not even writing. I'll just spend a lot of time kind of locked in there, and I'll go and like make food or take a shower or something and just
right.
like be thinking and putting myself in that world and trying to stay excited and inspired about the experience that's going to happen when I'm
Yeah.
playing this game. That's a
That's
huge thing for me.
That's really cool. And I have something that I wanted to add onto that, but I also really want to respond to what Geek Out said in the chat. which is I find that's the charisma curse. You don't ask the barbarian how they lift the stone door or act out an athletics check, but every DM expects persuasion and intimidate checks to be acted out, and I think unless you do that with every check, then don't. And my response to that is, you said you don't ask the barbarian how they lift the door, but I think you should. That's what I'm saying is I think you should ask the barbarian how they lift the door, because yeah, maybe they're just sticking their fingers under it and like heaving, but maybe they want to look for some like piece of like steel or something to leverage it or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that informs a more interesting sort of play, and you don't end up with, as Claire said, the QuickTime event skill. You end up with an actually interesting and engaging role playing moment to engage that skill. So I think you're right, absolutely. But I would say I think that you should be doing that. Like a DM should be asking their players those questions for other than charisma based things.
Yeah, they totally should. And I still think that even when you're dealing with like your social kind of character who's using persuasion, intimidation, etc., you still want to respect the reality that you have a player who has invested time to build a character to do this. They're building a character who lies very well. There might be a lot of hilarious role playing that happens where you'll say like, okay, that was a really good lie, add a +1 to your die. But like you still want to give them opportunities to use the mechanics that are on their sheet.
Yeah.
Well, like thinking about a one shot that I ran that Geek Outs in the chat is in. It's a part of the D&D 5e1 short shot that I'm running right now. But like when I was prepping for this, one of the things that I really liked that I've seen in a lot of shows is kind of like breakout scenes to introduce each of the characters at the beginning of a show or a game, kind of give them an opportunity to do something for themselves. And like that was a thing for me, as I all of the characters, all of the players sent me their characters and told me a little bit about them. Like I don't need a huge in-depth backstory since it's a short shot, but basically my planning was, okay, so I'm going to put each of them in a situation on their own. And for like Matt was like, I think my character made a deal with a hag. And so I was like, I just wrote like, bring back the hag, like, because I knew that would, and then I looked at his sheet and like, he was a mer person. So like I stranded him near like a lake and then brought this hag back to talk to him. Or like, I looked at another character who I knew could speak with animals at will. And I was like, okay, first session, I have to have an opportunity for her to speak with animals at some point in here. Right.
Yeah.
Yes, the Queen of Winter.
I agree, NB Santiago. Bring back the hag is a phrase that I need on a t-shirt.
I feel like I am inspiration for a lot of t-shirts around here. Like, what was the other one that we had a while back on a Borderlands stream? If you can't handle me at my fuck around, you don't deserve me at my find out.
But to go back to what you were saying a second ago, Claire, about music, not in terms of like writing it or just sort of or like playing it myself, but music or like a specific piece of music has been the entire basis of a whole story arc in a campaign of mine many times. Where like I'll be listening to a piece of music and that piece of music is evocative in a way like of a particular scene, and I'm like, great, now how do I get to that scene? And then the campaign arc sort of resolves around that. And then what I find is that I think it's like in anything else, right? Where like the more senses you engage, the more visceral the experience is. And because what I find is those moments when the campaign finally does get to that scene that I envisioned, it's such a compelling kind of like touchstone moment in the campaign. And it's one that's like extremely memorable because it's just here. Like I can see it. Like I can almost see it when I have that experience. And then that piece of music, because it evoked that scene, is perfect in that moment. And so you end up with this very strong scene. And like and I find myself like exactly like you said, like if I want to get myself excited about, the game again, I want to get myself hyped up and thinking, then I'll just play that piece of music.
Yeah. Go for a walk.
Yeah.
Just listen to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like when I there's specific, I have like little chunks of playlists that I know are devoted to different characters that I'm playing at any one time. And so like if I want to like, a day before a session or even like the day of a session, if I want to like kind of get back in my character's head, I'll listen to that. And I think another interesting thing in terms of that, like from the player side and thinking about music, is a lot of times music will inspire me to think of a scene that like has not happened, but that my character might be in at some point.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Right. And so anytime I listen to this piece of music, I can see my character like in this moment. And so then I as a player will search for ways to manufacture this like scene or this series of events that I've created. And sometimes I'll even like talk to my GM about it or talk to another player about like, I have this wicked idea that we have to make happen. Like,
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, since we're talking about music, because I know Freeman, you've brought up music before a lot, and when
Yeah.
it pertains to like finding inspiration for your characters, you've mentioned that before.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't even really familiar with the whole concept of making a playlist for your character until you brought it to our game,
Mm.
our home game. And that's when I thought, well, why don't I just do this to get in the character's mindset? And recently, with Mason, the detective style, the PI character I play in our Cypher game, music's been a big part of like how I get in the mindset for writing pieces or writing things for the character and just getting in the mindset. And since it's like a kind of a film noir style detective, it's jazz.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
that is I definitely like I haven't done it recently, but what I really want to do is like maybe half an hour before like call, kind of just do that and listen to music. I haven't done that for a while, but I think that's something I need to get back into because that puts you right there, right where you like, it puts you right in your character. I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't explain it really, but music is just, I can't explain it. You guys, you will do it better than me, all of you. But I can sometimes articulate, but it just puts me in the zone.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I know that there was an exercise that like a teacher that I had at one point used to do, which was they would ask us to in an English class in like I think it was like early British lit like Chaucer and stuff like that. But they
Oh,
basically
no.
yeah they she asked us to kind of doing like an exercise of like where she would say like okay cast the characters like using actors from today like cast
That's
these
cool.
characters and you know as a way of getting us to kind of explore how we pictured the characters and then what she would do is connect that back to like once we had our like oh yeah I would cast this person then she would connect that back to the writing which was like okay so here like what made you think of this particular actor and like what in the writing like what from the actual text made you think that and I think that's a really I did that in a couple of home games that I've run where I did this I brought the same concept to the players I was like hey think about what you would do, who you would cast as your character, and also, and then I added on to that. I was like, going back to the music thing. I'd be like, also, what would be like a piece of music that would be that character's theme, right? And so that was kind of a fun way of getting people to think about their characters. And teaching talk not from not John seems fake. Yeah,
I've
that's
been
right.
sitting here very quiet the
This
whole
time,
time.
this
I'm being
time
a
it was
good
me.
boy.
John's just a very skilled ventriloquist, and from across the country through a Zoom call.
Whoa, that is
Yeah,
that
actually,
is
It's a lot of
skilled.
skill.
Yeah.
it's I've got a just an incredible voice mod that I recorded.
You must.
Um,
It's going over like many miles.
mhm. Yeah, no, I was just
Wow.
gonna say like that's a really it's an interest like from a teaching standpoint. It's a really like cool way though to engage people in thinking about and I think also your players, right? Which is why I'm talking
Mhm.
about this, but like because it requires from a teaching standpoint, it requires the person like the students thinking about it to consider like a lot of different aspects about the character that they're thinking about that require a certain level of understanding of that character. And so if you're asking that, like, of your tabletop players, then you're asking them again for like that same level of kind of like high level understanding,
Yeah.
like beyond just like very simple details about something, because they have to like take what they know about their character and then like translate that to, okay, now who would best portray these traits that I know as an actor or an actress, right? So it's very high level cognition required from that one, or like in terms of like high level understanding of a concept. So
yeah, and it's a really good, like, that's a great exercise to do with people who are very new to role playing games. I think
Yeah.
people who have been doing this for a long time, they will like make a movie reference, kind of for the fun of it, to sort of say like, this character is being played by, this person. But I think for people who are new to it, who are struggling to like think about who their character is, once you start asking them like, who would play your character if this was a movie, they're going to start thinking about movies, and they're going to start thinking about a whole bunch of other things, and that's more than likely going to get them to start thinking about who they're playing now, which is really helpful. And if not, if other people are familiar with the actor or the movie, then other people at the table will also pick up on that and tune into that. So the kind of the sort of background of your pop culture starts to do a lot more of the heavier lifting of role playing than you as a player or performer.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I 100% agree. Like, I know especially when I'm running the game, I tend to think about the game very cinematically and like all just already. And so with that comes a certain amount of like, I find I'm much more able to do it with NPCs when I'm running a game than I am with, and also with like player characters, than I am with my own character. It's much harder for me to figure out who plays my character if I didn't start there, right? Like if I build the character around an appearance of somebody there, right, that's a different story. But if I start with the character, it's so much harder for me to find an actor who fits the character I've built. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's like a more interesting point to be made about that. It's just an interesting observation that I've kind of made over time. That's way easier for me to do that kind of visualization with other people's characters or with NPCs than it is with my own. I also know Rick Budd. I'm sure he does this just in general, but where I've seen it is on Power Play. He will often, when he introduces an NPC, he'll say, and I think this person is played by, and then we'll like think of like an actor, and I think that's a really interesting thing. It's, in a way, it's like almost immersion breaking, but in a way that I think is actually more helpful to staying in,
Yeah.
you know. And
Yeah, and I to the degree that it is potentially immersion breaking, I mean, I think it's the same as saying like, if a character is trying to persuade, or a player is trying to get their character to persuade someone and they don't want to act it out, and so you say, okay, well, what is your character trying to do? When you start doing that kind of where you're phrasing the fact that, out loud, that you're playing a game, with the actor kind of thing, it's sort of the same thing. It's someone saying, I don't exactly know what this is, but I'm going to reach for something, and I'm going to use this because everyone can relate to this. That's one of the beautiful things about RPGs. You don't have to be perfect, right? It can be something that is collaboratively built and kind of at your own pace. And there's very
yeah.
few things where you can do that, which is what I really enjoy.
Yeah.
explicit permission, by the way, for all the GMs out there, to, when your players walk into something that you're not fully prepared for, to just go like, what does this person's room look like? You have explicit permission to do this, because every time a GM has done that to me, it has been so cool. Like
Yeah, you know what? That's a really good point. And I think this is another thing that I've been thinking in terms of like the psychology approaching D&D after a long time of doing something not D&D, is exactly that. And this is something that I'm still working on for myself, is the ability to like to let go of the narrative at certain points, right? Like there are definitely times when I think it's pretty common and it's a common practice to let go of the narrative in certain places. But there are places where even now I'll see somebody talking about like, oh yeah, I say to my players, what does this look like, or what do you think this is happening here? What do you think happens? And I still catch myself reading those accounts and going, oh yeah, I guess I could do that, couldn't I? Right? Like because I think this is one of the things that I find. I won't make a blanket statement about D&D, but instead, so I'm
I
clarifying.
can do that for you.
There you go. Thank you. I'm clarifying here that this is purely about me. What I'm about to say is about me, which is that a thing that I know that in my trajectory towards like becoming the GM that I am today, in D&D, I picked up a lot of really. I internalized a lot of like, I think less than helpful. I don't think it's necessarily toxic, but it can easily become like toxic practices or mindsets, which is first and foremost, and anybody who watches Ramblemancy regularly will know exactly what I'm about to say. But first and foremost, the idea that you as the GM are an island, and that everything that is passes through you. It is filtered through you. And that is true to an extent, but it doesn't have to be. Especially with a system like D&D that puts a lot of narrative power in the hands of the DM and not very much in the hands of the players, then there's nothing intrinsic about the game that makes you do that. So at any time you can say, there's nothing in the rules that says the GM must take control of these things. At any time as the GM, you can say, "Oh, okay, so you're traveling. The journey takes 3 days. What are some difficult things that happen to you over the course of those days?" And you can just say that. You don't have to tell.
That's great. Yeah.
You could just say something like that, and chances are your players are going to be meaner to themselves than you ever would be. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of being a little mean to D&D and probably saying something that's a bit of a stretch, but also like D&D, I think, while it doesn't say that you have to kind of, have that level of control, there's a lot about D&D that kind of like encourages that, right? I mean, think about how the game is set up at a table with a giant DM screen where someone is like lording over people. And then think about the world where you've got like gods and feudal kingdoms, and it's all these stories about people in power and people underneath being crushed by others.
Yeah.
Like, in terms of setting a vibe.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
And like, it's interesting knowing what I know about like the limited amount that I know about like early versions of D&D, but a lot of people describe accounts of Gary Gygax like, doing this in his basement as like they were all sitting at a table, and then Gary had pull out all of the shelves on his cabinets so that you could to like block off his desk so you can see him, and you just kind of hear his voice drift out from behind them. And if you were too quiet, you might miss information, or if you were too loud, you might miss information. And like, granted, this is perhaps like an embellished account of it, but I've read that in a couple of places when I've been reading about like the origins of D&D and TSR and stuff like that. But early playtesting versions of AD&D. So like the screen has been there since the beginning. I suppose is what I'm getting at here.
No, and I definitely don't want to be misunderstood to say that like, oh, like D&D doesn't make you do that. I mean, because it does in a lot of ways. Like, I absolutely agree with everything that you said, Claire, which is that like there's a lot in there. Like I've said in a different context, which is that there's a lot in D&D that pressures you to say no to your players, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like just intrinsically in the way that it's designed, and the like fundamentally in the mechanics of the game. I think it's just as true in terms of like controlling the narrative, right? Who controls the narrative? And to clarify, what I think I mean to say there is that there's no explicit rule that says you can't give up control of the narrative to your players. So you can just decide that, you know what, I'm going to let you decide what happens, or what this room looks like, or what challenges you come across,
Yeah. And one of the things I had learned when I was on Cypher Unlimited last week, and we played GM Roulette, is that GM Roulette, which for those who are not familiar, is basically Cypher Unlimited is going to be putting out a PDF of it on Drive Through RPG soon. So there's going to be a whole way for you to play this game. But basically, you have got a bunch of people, and everyone takes a turn being a GM, trading off every 30 minutes. And that little exercise is kind of like proof of what happens when you give ultimate player agency, which is the GM, to every single character. And what happens? It's still a game. like the game still goes on. Now, granted, like the names for things can sometimes be forgotten because you're just going through stuff, and the story might end up being a little zany. But like that's what happens when you give everyone at the table a shot at having 100% control. And the end result is it's still a role-playing game that's a lot of fun.
You know what? It's so interesting how so much of role-playing games is kind of like a microcosm of something else in role-playing games, right? Because there's I think a certain
Good
like
night, koala.
oh, good night, koala. There's a certain mindset that I think not every player, but some players, especially if they're new, I think to TTRPGs, have, which is this idea that like, oh, we have a plan, and if our plan fails, then the game is over. It stops. And it's like, no, if the game, if your plan fails, the game's still gonna go somewhere. The game is still going to go somewhere. Maybe not where you expected, but it's still going to go somewhere. And I think that's also true, like, if you look at the meta of it, like you just said, the meta of the game, right? Which is that if you give ultimate agency, I think there's probably somewhere sort of subconsciously this fear that if you give agency, like unlimited agency to everybody, then somehow the game is going to break down. And, like, maybe to an extent that's kind of true because you need to have somebody sort of keeping everybody, focused at least. But in terms of, like, at the end of the day, regardless of what happens, everybody probably had a pretty good time.
Yeah.
Like, something happened.
And
maybe it's not what you thought was going to happen when you sat down, but something happened.
Oh, and like that's the joy of improv and the joy of tabletop RPGs is because if I'm rereading my favorite book, I know it's going to happen. But if I'm sitting down to play another game of Cypher with my friends, even if it's the same module, like something different could happen this time. The dice might fall a different way, or somebody just might make a different choice or latch onto a different thing that I've said as the GM or that another player says, right? Also, like, I've just been sitting here like with game designer brain thinking about GM-less RPGs and the way that like part of your job I think is not necessarily part of your job, but I think something that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about GM-less RPGs is that a lot of them like kind of have ways to bring the action back, like touchstones that keep it kind of grounded to prevent it from just kind of like it from just being like a free-form role-playing session where you
It's sort of like a disembodied GM.
Yeah. Right. So like I'm just thinking because a lot of the GM-less game experience that I have is games by Matthew Gravlin. But like I'm thinking about Tapestry or Mall Kids or something like that, where there's like Mall Kids, there's the schedule of the day or like beats throughout the day that you can kind of come back to. Like, okay, we know that we've played out the morning shift and now we're going to go on to lunch and then we're going to go on to the afternoon. And so like that kind of like that gives you kind of like a structure to the game that like normally perhaps a GM would provide, but in this case it's just another way to set up like a little framework to put yourself and the other players in and then operate inside.
Yeah, sorry, I'm reading chat now, and what Spig says is really interesting, which is it wasn't until growth of other RPGs after first edition that the concept of narrative control really took off, which is interesting because
if I'm correct, and I could be wrong, I mean, someone could cite this, and I'm not going to, but I'm pretty sure that like D&D in general, like evolved out of wargaming, of just like running battle scenarios.
D&D, like it was basically the order of operations here was you had like war games where people would simulate like say like the Napoleonic Wars or something like that, and they had like dice and all of these other things and like very just tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of rules for like simulating combat between these huge armies. And then basically a couple of dudes who really liked Lord of the Rings and Conan the Barbarian and a bunch of other fantasy like novels sat down and were like, but what if you could play a single wizard? And everyone else was like, that's dumb, except for these two dudes who were like, but what if you could? And then they basically designed AD&D, which was the rule set for playing a very specific set of character. Well, it went from there to like they designed that to work within the war games, and then AD&D came out of their like hack for their war games. And I think that's the short version of
Yeah.
how AD&D came to be.
Yeah. Well, and I think that idea of there having to be narrative in the game at all is like relatively not new, but like even after it was no longer exclusively a war game, it was still a game about like going into dungeons and getting treasure, and that was it.
Yep. There wasn't a setting for Dungeons and Dragons until I can't remember what the name of the first one was.
Was it Greyhawk? I think it was Greyhawk.
It was Greyhawk. Yeah, it was Greyhawk.
Yep.
There wasn't a setting for Dungeons and Dragons until Greyhawk. So
yeah. So yeah, I think it's interesting that we place so much. I feel like there's been a huge inflation of what the DM's job is in D&D specifically, right? Like over time, as like people's expectations of the game evolved, the DM's job I think has just like it has just kind of turned into bloat in a lot of cases. And so like whenever you can divest yourself of some of that, do it. You will be so much happier whenever you can say, whenever your players go like, okay, what does the ruin look like? And he's like, I don't know. What does the ruin look like? Why don't you tell me? What does the ruin look like?
You guys have got a general vibe for this place. Tell me what you're seeing.
Yeah.
And like that's like I said, I'm saying this as someone who hasn't done that anywhere near enough. Like I'm saying this as somebody who wants to try to do that more. Like that's currently a thing that I am working on trying to do a lot more of.
Yeah, I very rarely do that because I'm often like I'm interested in like what it sounds like in the ruin, what it smells like in the ruin. So even if I don't write it down, my players are usually going to get a little bit of description from me just reflexively. I'm just going to be like, this is what color the walls are, or this is the quality of the air in here is very crushing or something like that.
Yeah, and like it's one of those things where like it's a tool like any other, which is to say that it's not to be used in every situation.
Oh yeah,
it's one of those things that you'd want to make sure that you applied it judiciously, right? If in a situation where, for instance, like the thing that got me thinking along these lines is when prepping for this particular game of D&D that I'm running, it was that like I wanted the wilderness and travel to be a much more centralized part of the game. And I know overland travel has it's
hard to do.
It's hard to do, and there's a lot of people who like the common wisdom seems to be just don't do it. Just hand wave it and just go to the next important point. But that's for like 9 D&D games out of 10, I'd say great. But for the 10th game, the one I'm running, where that was intentionally designed into the framework of the game, where the game wasn't just about, as Matt Colville says, running around the map collecting plot tokens to turn into the DM so that you could advance the story. The game becomes more about the destination. Then you need to actually start thinking about like, how does overland travel work? Like, how do you actually run overland travel? And for me, one of the answers that I have come up with and haven't gotten a chance to try yet because we haven't gotten there in the game yet, is the idea of during the course of travel asking the players like, what is a challenge that you deal with over the course of this 3-day journey, 4-day journey, whatever it is, right? Saying, what is something that you and another player character talk about over this time, and then taking their this is my plan. I haven't tried this yet, but then once they respond, then taking what they say and then deciding, you as the DM get to decide, is this a scene or is this just a thing that happened during, right? And I think that might be because think about like an actual journey, right? Think about like taking a road trip today. What does that road trip largely consist of? Nothing. Or conversations. That's what you're doing. You're interacting, and I think it's I wouldn't say it's a mistake to treat overland travel in tabletop games like they are survival situations exclusively, but I think it's maybe if you do that, you might be making a lot more work for yourself, giving yourself a lot more headaches, and B, overlooking what like one of the most important and I think useful uh, outcomes that your travel can have, which is role-playing moments.
Yep. Yeah, travel is, I mean, it's that is a huge thing for me, and I envision my campaigns with travel in mind, and a lot of that is because like a big part of my inspirations and my influences are like late 90s era Final Fantasy games. And try pulling out all of the overland travel from like Final Fantasy VII. You don't have a story. You know, the characters literally move through they move across the surface of the world, and the story unfolds that way.
Yeah.
When they get to a new town, and then either something happens, the car breaks down, so now they have to go to this town, and well, now you're going to find out all of Red 13's story, or then you get to, you know, Nibelheim, and now you're going to dig more into Cloud and Tifa's backstory. So like overland travel, yes, the kind of like you're moving through the forest and you're looking for random encounters, that stuff can be very tricky. But like the idea of moving through a space is a unbelievably valuable opportunity to tell some like profound stories and give your players the sense that they're moving through a world.
Yeah, exactly. And I saw Spigs said overland travel can be fun if done correctly, but can quickly turn into a series of just random encounters that can get stale if the GM isn't careful or if your group isn't experienced in creating inter-party role-playing. And I think, so here's an interesting thing to address that, Spigs. I actually... I was watching, again, looking for inspiration to kind of figure out how to do overland travel. I was watching one of Dale Kingsmill's videos recently where she created a distinction that I had never thought about before, but it makes so much sense, which is that random encounters, the reason they feel so, like, I imagine that most of you, if you've run overland travel and tried to use random encounters as, like, a staple of that, felt like it was either too much or just wasn't accomplishing what you wanted it to. And Dale Kingsmill put her finger, I think, on why that is, and it's because random encounters are not best used in travel scenarios. They're best used in exploration.
That's, yeah.
Where
I get that. Yep.
Yeah, where it's not about like the random encounter from here to there. Not to say you can't do that, because I think you should. But that should be one of the things. But it shouldn't be your main thing. It should be kind of the main thing in exploration, because there it's not a point A to point B, and the random
you're turning over stones.
Yeah, exactly. And like when in a point A to point B kind of thing, the random encounter is just that random. It feels like it's just halting everything. But when you're already just like wandering around a place, trying to find, trying to explore the place, then random encounters make a lot more sense.
Yep.
And I thought that was fascinating. When she said that, I was like, wow, yes, that's why that doesn't work for me.
Yeah. I think one of the only times that random encounters while traveling to a place has been particularly effective for me was that one time that you guys rolled a rock.
Oh, yeah.
When you were traveling, like in our home D&D campaign, and you're like, well, we could fight this big fuck off bird, or we could not. And so it was basically just like a couple days of like travel, and it didn't wind up taking like over much out of the game to avoid, but it was just like a fun way to pass the travel scene. In that case, is just like, as opposed to just like you hike along the road for 3 days, it was, like 45 minutes, an hour of like, we do this to get from this point to this point, and like we bump into this or we search for this, and like, so it made for in that case, I think a very flavorful like traveling sequence.
You know what it felt like to me, having been a player in that sequence? It felt like reading, oh gosh, was it the Two Towers, where Frodo and Sam, honestly, like, disclaimer, this is my least favorite part of the Two Towers, but Frodo and Sam, like, crawling across, like, the areas trying to get to Mordor, and then all of a sudden, like, the Nazgul would fly over, and they had to, like, hide, because what are you going to do against that? You're a hobbit. Like, and that, I think that's what it felt like to me, where it, like, felt like there was some more meaningful interaction to that encounter than just fight it. and suddenly it became a hazard. I think treating even like creature encounters, treating them as hazards over combat encounters might actually also do some of the work to solving some of this problem. Right? Like if you've got a pack of wolves, like Geekouts is saying, said in the chat, like most wild animals want to avoid people, but for the ones who
that's
don't,
a great point.
yeah, and for the ones who don't, like a pack of wolves that it's hunting, don't treat it as a combat encounter. Treat it as like a hazard, where like you hear them howl off in the distance, and now you're like, oh shit, they're coming. You hear another one off in the other direction. You're like, they are closing in on us. Now what do we do? That's the setup for that is very different, and like what the players do after that is so different than the setup of like suddenly a pack of wolves bursts through the bushes, and suddenly you've suddenly removed any option other than fighting. Or at the very least, you've made fighting the most viable solution to the problem.
Yeah, and you know, to keep going with like what Geeks Out said, especially with like wild animals want to avoid people, and not to not sound a bit too much like a PETA advocate here, but like when you're dealing with overland travel and like the only reason for there to be wildlife is for you to shoot arrows and swing swords at it, like what exactly are you communicating about the world that you're living in here? This is just a shooting gallery, like so it's kind of shallow to do the random encounters like that, because like I remember I went back and I played Skyrim for the first time in like a really long time, and I really didn't like Skyrim, and I finally figured out why, which was when I started to go out and explore and shit just started attacking me. And then I was like, okay, so this entire world exists for me to run around and shoot fire out of my hand at things. Like this is not really something for me to have some type of experience through.
Yeah. That's a good point. Huh.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of the times when I'm going through Skyrim, I'll play. What's the character who can calm animals? I forget which. It's one of the elves.
Yeah.
And they have the ability to just calm wood elves. Yeah, they just like calm. They're just like, all right, mountain lion, it's all good.
Everybody be cool.
I won't be in your territory long. I promise. I'm not here for your dinner. We're cool. Go on. But yeah, I totally agree. It's like everything is coming after you, and
oh my god, being hunted by a fucking mud crab from a mile away, so you can't fast travel. Like, what have I done to you?
But that's the thing. No one enjoys really doing that. And the only reason you enjoy doing that is that you could like level up a bit so you could do some more stuff. So that's just the game being like, here's stuff for you to do so you can crunch your numbers. And in a role-playing game, we don't have to do that.
Yeah. What use do I have for 67 mud crab chitin? The answer is none. There's no use for 67 mud crab chitin. Why do I pick it up? I don't know. I loot things and I press loot all and then I keep walking. Like,
the only time I pay attention to what's in my inventory is when there's too much of it.
Yeah.
And I literally cannot move.
I know. That's right. Yeah. Geek Out says armor, John, and I'm just imagining the dragonborn just like with like mud crab claw hands and just like walking through town, just like armor entirely made out of mud crabs. Man, it's very funny to me. Like almost, it's like a Christmas story, like walking along, like barely able to move.
Someone will make it.
I saw
it's a mod now.
It's funny because most written adventures include their random encounter tables in the overland travel section. Maybe if they put it somewhere else in adventure, it wouldn't make DMs pull out random encounters during traveling scenes. Great point. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too. Like, I mean, I've never run a module. Like, I've played in like in a written module, but I've not. Sorry, I'm thinking back now to my experience playing in that module, which was Tomb of Annihilation, which is, well, it likes to bill itself as a hex crawl, but what it actually is very disappointing end to a campaign after you've been demoralized by the third character death. Anyway, but like the hex crawl part of it is kind of interesting, and I think the random encounters work in that one for two reasons. One, it is in fact an exploration because you're trying to find the lost city of Omu, right? So it is an exploration thing. But two, it works because you're explicitly told at the very beginning, The jungle is overrun with things that want to eat you or, in some way kill you. Undead or beasts like dinosaurs that are just looking for a meal, right? And so that it's set up that way where like the whole setup for the game, my mind going into that game was constantly on, we're out in the jungle. Things out here either want to eat us or they are going to be eaten by the other things. And like that and the goal is to not be the ones being eaten. And so that made it, I think, a bit more effective.
Yeah, and the randomness in a situation like that too also makes the scope of the jungle probably a lot more believable, because it's really hard to sell like, oh, you are in a very deep jungle with a lot of danger.
Yeah.
I mean, you can like, especially with jungles, forests, places that are hard to like draw a map necessarily, with like corridors and rooms. If you really want to convey a scale of depth and wild, random can do that for you. And that's why it's really good when you reserve it for that, for when you're going to have the random encounters. It's for when I want this place to kind of feel almost like it's like it has a will of its own. We're going to roll the dice and we're going to see what you find.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw somebody earlier. I meant to call it out sooner, but I Robeatnik said travel is such an important part of world building. I think that's like you started to kind of get into that a little bit, Claire, when you kind of mentioned it earlier. But yes, I think that's what I'm hoping to accomplish with in the game that I'm running. Because in the game that I'm running, it's not your kind of standard D&D. It's sort of a much more low fantasy. It's post-apocalyptic fantasy is what I'm running essentially. Okay. And I'll talk about the psychology of that like thinking of it that way brings to the game, but the idea of travel in that sense now suddenly has a whole different meaning. That's why I wanted to make travel central to that game, because it is a game where it's a world where basically people where they exist in their villages and their pockets of civilization, they are tiny little enclaves that are separated by vast stretches of wilderness, and it's the travel component of a game like that serves to emphasize the reality of the world, which is that people here are not thriving. They're in a full-on survival situation, right. At all times, even within their, enclaves of civilization, they're still in like a survival situation. And it's supposed to serve that point. And I think that is one of the ways that I think I want to incorporate travel into the world building, is to sort of inform that flavor of the world that I've spent so much time building. The other thing I was going to say was about the psychology of genre, like genre psychology, right? That changes how you approach a game.
Completely.
And not even in the ways that are obvious, like, oh yes, well in sci-fi there are laser guns and spaceships, and in fantasy there's swords. Like that's not what I mean. I mean treating, like, even for me, like treating a D&D game like a post-apocalypse game. Suddenly I'm thinking about totally different things than I would have been thinking about if I was just running a high fantasy game. It's something, it's a revelation that I had just in the last like week or so, but it's one that, like, it's one of those that you have it and you're like, wow, why did that not occur to me sooner, but yeah. So thinking about, like, on the subject of prep, I think having an idea of what genre you're trying to evoke, regardless of what the actual genre of the game is, matters, and it can highly inform what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, and I think, as someone who runs a lot of Numenera, a game that often gets referred to as science fiction or sci-fi, which it can do that easily. It's got technology in it, sure, but like really, it's a fantasy setting, and the reason why it's a fantasy setting is because it's a world filled with wonder.
Yeah.
So when I'm prepping for a Numenera game, my concern is like, what is the wonder here? And most of the Numenera games I run tend to fall more on the sort of fantasy end of the spectrum, and I embrace that and love that. If I was playing a game where someone wanted to play like a very bookwormish nano with a write who is very focused on crafting and all the little particulars of that, that would probably get more into like a science fiction vibe, and that would totally change how I'm gonna devise a ruin they're gonna go in. They may not be interested in going into a ruin where like they start having like weird memories and flashbacks to the time they were born. They are probably going to like it more if it's like they're exploring a spaceship where they could possibly get the engine to work again.
Right.
And that's where the genre is really going to influence how you're gonna prep for that. Or even if it were more of a fantasy thing and you're doing something where it's like, okay, they're going to go into this like spaceship ruin and they're going to activate an engine again. Well, if you're more in the fantasy end of it, what is that engine going to look like? What is it going to sound like? Who built it? Why did they build it? How does this thing get there? That's going to look totally different.
Yeah.
Potentially. The thing with Numenera is it can always be a kind of moving target, which is nice because then you can always surprise your players with new things, and you can flip a switch and be like, we've had a fantasy stint for a long time, so we're gonna get a little bit into the technical stuff, and when we're done with that, we're gonna go back to things feeling magical, so you can keep refreshing that. But yeah, the perspective of the genre, what you're, I think the like a term I had used before, like the theater of the game you're playing, what understanding what you're delivering. And like when I had run my vampire game this week, there was some really horrible things in there because that's the point. I mean, there were a couple of vampires who were basically feeding off of a human piano player, and were commenting on the change in the texture of the piece the pianist was playing as they were sipping off of his blood. Like I decided to prepare that little scene because I knew this game should like terrify people. Or it should like really like existentially freak them out that this is happening before their eyes.
Well, and it makes sense because in that game, it's a matter of, from my understanding, and I could be totally off base because I've never played Vampire, but from my understanding,
I'm very green with it, so I'm certainly not an authority.
the sort of central tension within that game is between like being a person and giving into the beast.
Yep.
And that's the central tension there. So having a scene like that, it directly ties into that central tension of that game, because that's exactly what you're saying. You're like, these are people who are commenting on like the refinement of art and music and that kind of thing while eating a person.
Yes.
And that's beautiful. That's an amazing scene because it perfectly encapsulates that. Like, yeah.
The whole point of that genre is, how long can you or if you even do want to hang on to your humanity. And the rules work that way too, right? So if you're prepping, like, you understand that the mechanics, the hunger, your humanity, the dots that are on your character sheet, that's a part of playing that game. So it's not just sort of like a narrative kind of like,
Right.
oh, when are we no longer humans? It's like, well, no, actually there is a number to tell you that.
It's quantifiable.
It is. And then of course the kind of political theater of it as well. And so you're prepping for that. So again, with like, my, piano player scene, what else, how else do you demonstrate power? By that.
Yeah.
like that clearly defines like who's in charge here. They're doing this and everyone's cool with this.
Like Monster Hearts has the same kind of thing where past a certain point, like you succumb to like whatever the particular like character skin's monstrosity is, right? And it's basically like it's a horror romance game. And like I think Monster Hearts is very, very interesting for that. Like I haven't played it before, but I've read Monster Hearts 1 and Monster Hearts 2. And like that's just that kind of thing is fascinating to me. Like there's a number here on my character sheet that has a powerful effect on the narrative.
Yeah.
And that's where prepping for mechanics is like really important to pay attention to. You do not need to know every rule in the book. No one does. So it's like, what rules are important for that that game?
Yeah.
So it's like, if I'm prepping vampire, I need to know the kind of humanity and hunger mechanics, because that's why you play this game. If the beauty about Cypher system is there kind of really is only one mechanic, which is just 1 to 10, how hard is it, and here's the number you have to roll, and here's how you can move that number. But that too, like, that's important. Like, if you're going to run Cypher system, you need to know like how to adjust that difficulty, what can adjust that difficulty, so that when a player asks you, I want to do this, you have a rough idea of how that is done, because that's the whole point of the game is to, or not the whole point of the game, but at least to interact with the mechanics. That's a really important thing for the game to kind of function. So you want to cover your bases with that. You want to understand like your basic conditions for success and conditions for failure, and what else is important for either a specific character or the entire game that you're playing.
Yeah. I kind of want to take because we're sort of running out of time here, but I do want to take a different approach to the same topic that we're on right now about like the genre and like the theater, as you said, and look at it also because there's another side of this, and that is the player side of that, of buying into like the theater of the game, and players kind of preparing for understanding what genre they are. Because like, it's one thing if you as the GM are setting up the theater and the flavor of the game that you're playing, but at a certain point, like, you can only do that so much without without also having the players meet you, not I wouldn't say halfway, but like at least like they'll meet you like 3/4 of the way. they'll go like maybe a quarter of the way towards you. And so I'm curious what thoughts you all might have on like prepping for that aspect of a game as a player. Like the understanding that what you're coming into isn't a high fantasy D&D game, but a post-apocalyptic fantasy, right? That kind of thought.
I think I think from a player perspective, it's one of those things where like when I hear that, I immediately like, I want to know about the core conceits of the world so that I can like add to it. So I can sculpt my character to make them belong, or like maybe defy some trope of this place, like, or feed it, like play into something, right? I think that like my thought is immediately like, okay, so like I have a vibe and I know kind of what genre I'm playing. So now how can I add my character to the story of this world? And that's why I love it when GMs give me maps of places that have cryptically and vaguely ominously titled things on them.
The Demon Spire.
The Demon Spire, the Maw, like just a big
Maw.
fucking hole in the ground on the map. Like, I don't know what happened there, but or like for the homebrewed 5e game that I play on Sunday nights right now, Castle Shatterguard. Like, I'm like, that sounds cool as hell. My DM's like, yeah, nobody goes there, they all die. And I'm like, my character, somebody that my character knew got lost near there. And he's like, why would you give this to me? I'm like, cause it's interesting.
Yeah, that reminds me. I had fleshed out a town for a Numenera game I was running, and I filled in a bunch of districts. And one was kind of not only it was a town that was there's a river running through it, and it was a district basically where the I don't know the terms for this stuff because I'm a GM. I'm not an architect. The wall that was holding back the water wasn't a wall anymore. So that district kind of got flooded, and I just called it the Crumble. And so as soon as my players got in there was this one of them was like, I'm going to the Crumble. He had no idea what was in there, but it was just because it was called the Crumble, and the visual I showed kind of made it look like it was almost underwater.
Yeah.
I'm thinking also about like just the cyberpunk game that Geek Outs ran for me and a couple of other friends. Like, each of the players in that helped to design part of the map. Like Matt was pretty much like, where's your character from? I was like, I don't know, probably Cargo Town. I was like, what's in Cargo Town? He's like, I don't know. And I was like, a lot of cargo containers. And I was like, great. And we just went from there,
Yeah. going along with that, I saw NB Santiago said in chat, as a player, I always wait for the GM to toss me the ball because then I can play, like, even for a one shot. Give me an opening scene, give me an NPC, give me something to bounce off of, then I'm in. That's fair. Like, that is I think I might be along those same lines too as a player. I think I like to think about my characters beforehand and how they fit into the world, but I don't know that I think I don't actually start thinking about my character until the GM tosses me the ball, like you said. That's a really good point, and I guess I'd never really thought about it that way, but here we have NB Santiago making me realize things about myself on stream. So thank you.
This is why we love Twitch chat.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Freeman, were you going to say something?
No idea. Well, I was gonna say, like, sometimes having the ball tossed your way is really good, because for me, I'll overthink something and then I'll end up not really acting on something. If you throw something at me, then I'm like, then the little bit of improv skill that I have will fire off a little bit, and then I don't know, it'll just happen.
Yeah, it's
so
kind of a little bit like telling you, the player, like, hey, I know everything's very big and overwhelming, but here's one specific thing. Focus on this right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is really, really helpful, actually, to ground you and your character very well, actually, I think. Now that I think about it.
They said, I can think about my PC all I want, but until I'm acting as that character in universe, my PC does not exist.
That's a fantastic point.
That, you know what?
that's
I don't think I've ever realized that I do the same thing. Like, I think I like to think that I think about my PC beforehand, and that I like to think about, like, I'll do little things, like when I know something about the character, I'll be like, oh, I'll imagine little potential scenes where that might play out. But I truly don't think I actually really start thinking about my player or my character and their place in the world until I'm actually in it. So that's
until you're playing the game.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Huh. And yet I know that there are plenty of players who don't do that. Who, like John mentioned, one of our friends, who will he'll ask you all kinds of questions about the world and then will meticulously write out his backstory, his entire family. He'll create NPCs for his entire family. He'll write the entire history of the clan that he came from, and like all this stuff, and then he'll be like, here you go, and he'll just be like, great, I'm not gonna read this until it becomes relevant. and
I think that's why, like, player or GM, a huge part of the prep is knowing who you're going to be playing with. You need to know, for the vampire game I ran, I did something really horrible, which no one should ever do. I didn't tell them they were playing vampire. Now, to be clear, we did play a World of Darkness game a bunch of months ago. So I knew, again, knowing your players, I knew that they had the appetite and the temperament for what would be in that game. And the only thing I did was I sent them a Google form that I made that just asked them a bunch of questions that allowed me to take some of the quick start character build stats in the book and just apply that to that. And they had no idea what they were playing. They thought it was just going to be a kind of like anything goes RPG or something, until I kind of walked them through their basically what was happening to them, their embrace. And I was like, well, welcome to Vampire the Masquerade.
That's
but so don't do that to people, not with that game. But the reason why I could do that, the reason why I could prep for that game in that way, was because I knew who I was playing with. Although someone did throw me a fastball and their significant other joined the game, and I had to quickly text somebody to like ask questions to be like, what kind of movies does this person like?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's how you can, I think you can really prep for a game when you know that you have a player who like feels like they need something to work with, they need something to bounce off of, or you have the player who's like, here's a novel. And once you know that, once you have that expectation, I think you can prep for a game a lot more efficiently and in a way that's going to resonate with those players or the GM. And the same thing again, understanding who your GM is, understanding what they like to do, how they like to set scenes, how they like to describe scenes, and how your character is going to fit into that or change that or contribute to it.
Yeah. I think Oh, go ahead, John.
I was just going to comment that I think that player from our home game wrote more for his character backstory in like 2.5 weeks than I wrote for all of NaNoWriMo last year. So like,
And we love him for it.
we do.
Yeah, well, as much as I want to keep talking about this, we are at the end of our time. So this has been such a like interesting conversation. I love talking about this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
This is yeah, so Claire, we're gonna have to have you back at some point.
I would love that. And thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So everybody, thank you so much for coming, for hanging out with us tonight, for chatting and sharing your thoughts with us. For some just quick reminders, coming up this week, we have Into Deep, our Waterdeep Dragon Heist actual play with an all LGBTQ plus cast, at 4 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesday. We have our Cypher System sci-fi superheroes game Infinite Horizon, 6 p.m. Pacific time on Wednesday. And we will have this very show, Ramblemancy, at 7 p.m. Pacific on Friday, where we will be joined by some of the Into Deep cast for an Into Deep takeover of Ramblemancy. And correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I believe next Saturday we have our Borderlands game?
Yes,
Borderlands
we
stream?
do.
It's true.
So, yeah.
Yep, it's the last Saturday. That's all, folks.
Get out of here. Get out of here. Damn it.
Yeah, next Saturday is the last Saturday of the month, and you know what that means at Rule of Lore. It's Borderlands time.
Yep.
Explosions?
It's time for everyone else to shoot enemies and me to shoot things that blow up my friends. And shoot my friends a lot, but that's because it heals them.
Mm-hmm.
Helpful bullets?
Friendship bullets.
Friendship bullets.
So yeah, if you are not already on our Discord, you should be, because that's where you're gonna get all of the most up-to-date information about anything that's happening on the channel. We generally go to Discord first, so you can keep this conversation going in the Ramblemancy channel, or you can just sort of hang out and chat with people about stuff, TTRPGs even. So yeah, that's definitely
Discord?
something. Which
Discord.
get out, get out of here, John.
Okay, bye.
It's this Discord. Oh no!
Bit.
Oh, that's horrible.
This bit has been with us from
It's
the
evergreen.
very beginning. Has been
It's
from the
evergreen.
beginning of this.
Evergreen. It's evergreen.
Oh.
Anyway.
Oh.
Yeah. So, if you are interested at all in following along with stuff that we do, Discord's the place that you're gonna want to be. What was I gonna say? I fully just that whole bit just derailed me. I had momentum. It's gone now.
If you are looking for ways to support the channel, we are affiliates here on Twitch, so you can hit the subscribe button and get access to a whole bunch of cool emotes designed by a variety of artists, actually, I think. But they're fun little rewards that you get for pushing the subscribe button or gifting subs or being gifted a sub. We also have a Patreon where monthly we post a list of the media that everybody on our cast and staff have been into this month. And we also twice a month put out Tabletop Tool Chest, which is just kind of our little catalog of adventure or NPC or just like little bits of world building prompts for you to sprinkle into your writing or your tabletop RPGs. So you can find all of that and more on our page. Oh, plus bonus content for some of our shows like character journals. Subscribing gets you access to the whole backlog of those. So anytime really is the best time to subscribe. And if you subscribe to the highest tier to our Patreon, you can help us do world building for Infinite Horizon, the aforementioned sci-fi spacefaring superheroes actual play on Wednesdays. So
yeah.
Oh, we have a merch store too. We have some some cool challenge.
Oh, we have merch
Stickers
We-
or,
stickers, baby.
wait, no, I have merch within reach for once.
You do.
Yes.
Yeah, we actually. This is season
am I-
one.
No,
Or
I'm not wearing my Infinite Horizon shirt.
Of rolling away now.
nice.
You can get very comfortable shirts that say Infinite Horizon.
Technically, you can't technically right now because that shirt is still on hold for some reason in the merch store. So we might
Shake
have
me
to
my
revisit
fist
it.
at Streamlabs.
Yeah.
The hoodie, then.
The hoodie, though, you can get the hoodie.
The hood-
Also very
Yeah.
cozy.
Of course, if the Patreon is too much of a long-term thing, then you can always hit up our coffee. I almost said Ko-Fi. I just can't help it. I have to
I
say
know
it's
it
not.
looks
But yeah,
like Ko-Fi.
it looks so well. You can have the coffee. It has a lot of our short-term goals written on there. Things like our music, our art, our emotes, things like that. Make us look cool. So yeah, there's that. You can check that out too.
Claire,
Yeah.
where can we find you?
You can find me mostly on YouTube at The Infinite Construct, which is all things Numenera and by extension Cipher System. Today's video was on the salvaging and crafting mechanics that are in Numenera Destiny, which are often a place that people get very lost. It's a very detailed and dense mechanical system. And so this video is actually more about the iotum, which are the materials that you're working with, it's a really fantastic way to expand Numenera because you have now this new material that actually any character type can use. So you can check that out, The Infinite Construct on YouTube. I'm also I'm on Twitch, The Infinite Construct. I occasionally stream some games. I've recently been chewing my way through Devil May Cry 4, but occasionally I'll spin up a game that is kind of themed with science fantasy. You can find me on Twitter at INF Construct because those were the character limits I had to work with. And if you want to support The Infinite Construct right now, you can either listen to Soundscapes for Spaces Beyond on Spotify, literally under The Infinite Construct, or you can buy high resolution audio files of those on Bandcamp. So theinfiniteconstruct.bandcamp.com. And those are specifically meant for role-playing games. They're ambient soundscapes that sort of just drift in the background, very much inspired by the Ninth World in Numenera, but overall in general it's science fantasy. So they're all about 10 minutes long and you can just loop them, and yeah, so that's
They're super
where I am.
cool. I went on Spotify the other day and was listening to a bunch of them. They're really, really cool.
Thank you.
So you should check them out. Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, we are going to go, but we will hopefully see you back here on Tuesday for In Too Deep. But if not, we'll see you the next time you decide to come roll with us. Good night and good zone, everybody.